So welcome to our business modernization workshops. My name is John Mancini. These are sponsored by DocPoint. And some of you may not be familiar with DocPoint, but you may be familiar with their partner, who is QAI, Quality Associates. Both are wholly owned subsidiaries of Konica Minolta. And their focus is on deploying M365 successfully, particularly with three sort of emphases. The first is that they have deep experience with M365, but also with multiple other ECM systems and how those two, either complement or conflict with each other. They have a real deep understanding of translating business requirements into technical solutions, and they are particularly focused on questions of business process. So we're really fortunate today to start the series with a focus on the business process of compliance and records, which is one that's near and dear to all of us that are in this space. It really is a timely topic. Every time I turn around, there are, yet another instance of companies and organizations getting into trouble from a lack of focus on records and compliance. And so, we've long struggled in this space. Those of you that have known me for a long time know that I've been doing this for quite some time, but we've been focused on trying to deal with the complexity of this issue. And one of the things I think that M365 brings to the table is a way to simplify this a bit for organizations so that they can get a robust record solution and at the same time get something that doesn't require a lot of external additional solutions on top of M365. So we have a question tab, so we would love to have questions along the way. You'll also see that you have voting and commenting capabilities. One of the things that I think is kind of fun along the way is if you know the answer to a question that somebody asks, please go ahead and just chime in. You'll save us along the way. And I often find that the audience has just as much, if not more, expertise in some of the areas that we address as we do. So we really encourage you to take advantage of that. We will be circulating a copy of the presentation, and we will be circulating a recording of the presentation. So feel free to distribute them to anybody in your organization. We'd love, the more the merrier in terms of that. I'm really pleased to have Erica Tully with us today. Erica is Senior Product Marketing Manager at Microsoft, where she leads the worldwide business strategy for Microsoft Purview Data Lifecycle and Records Management. She has 18 years of experience in the space. Anybody who's been in the space for a long time knows Erica Tully because she has been a leader in this space for quite some time. One of the things that she likes to talk about in particular is, and I think this is where things get really timely, particularly in an AI era, is this convergence between data governance, security, compliance, privacy, and records. And that intersection is really, I think, at the heart of a lot of the issues that organizations are going to have to deal with if they want to really optimize their approach to AI moving forward. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Erica. I'll probably be kibitzing along the way. And again, feel free to chime in with questions. We love to hear them, and we'll either get them along the way or we'll get them at the end. So Erica, take it away.
Perfect. Thanks, John. Really excited to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. So we'd love to have a business-focused conversation with you today. John, as you mentioned in the intro, compliance is something that every company knows they need to do, but oftentimes the practicalities of actually doing it can be a bit challenging, right? Because it involves so much with people, process, culture, as well as technology enablement. So thinking about how to maybe break down the complexities, thought it would be good to start with just some really key trends that I'm seeing in terms of scenarios that are driving especially executive level visibility of compliance programs. And then, the million-dollar question: can the requirements of these programs be met out of the box with Microsoft 365? And then next is the other hot question around licensing. And then lastly, just looking across both of our experience, what are some of the top lessons learned and tips and tricks that we see over and over again across industries, countries, all different sizes of organizations? Great. With that, let's just start jumping right in. So what are the top scenarios driving adoption of Microsoft 365 compliance? Before we dive into scenario number 3, because I'll be counting down to the top scenario here, this isn't a technology problem, right? It's a business, a people, a process challenge and program that should be enabled by the technology, right? Technology shouldn't be driving the compliance program. It just is, Microsoft 365 is a popular tool to use in the workplace. And so that's why we'll focus on that a lot in this presentation. So, I think in this group, it's no surprise that the increase in privacy regulations over since 2016, when GDPR came into the industry, that's really put a focus on having a good record keeping program and good compliance practices. John, I don't know about you, but when I first read through GDPR, I thought, isn't this just the stuff we've been trying to do all along?
It seems like that, yeah. And then you kind of have sons and daughters of GDPR along the way. And I don't know about you, Erica, but I think that we're going to see more and more of this and more confusion along the way, because states will try to address this problem, then you have and countries will try to address this problem, and yet if you're a global organization, you have to operate everywhere. And so used to be, I think, that people might address this in sort of a little, do what they can way, but that ad hocery is going to kill them if they try to figure out how to meet all of those in an ad hoc way.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. No one wants to show up in the newspaper because they got a really big GDPR or, California Consumer Privacy Act or other fine, or, violated the regulation. So this, has put a lot of budget, frankly, and executive attention on things like good record keeping. We might not get to call it records management when we're in the meeting with the executive, but that's what we're doing.
Yeah, I have a friend, Mark Patrick, who does a lot of work on the Joint Chiefs at DoD, and he says it's really key to know the language of the people to whom you were speaking. And we all are very comfortable with certain terms, but that doesn't mean the executive suite is.
Yeah, and actually, I don't have a slide on that, but that's a really good tip for working with executives. Like, talk to their business admin, to other people who present to them regularly, and find out like the vocabulary they use to talk about these things, and you adapt to them. Yeah. All right, so scenario number 2 is cybersecurity. So obviously, again, no one wants to show up in the news because they had a data breach, a leak of personal or sensitive data, and then the fines associated with that. And guess what? Cybersecurity is all about finding where your sensitive data lives. So, where's the most valuable and critical information for your business? Records managers and other compliance practitioners probably already have an idea. And then you don't have to protect data that you don't have. So the deletion part of the content lifecycle is becoming more and more important, or even archive to get it out of maybe the everyday user's sphere of influence, where if their account's compromised, the attacker would have access to it. And if it's not providing everyday business value, why are you taking the risk of having it sitting there? John, are you seeing anything around this?
Yeah, I think that this is also an area that is just changing like at warp speed right now, particularly with the focus on There was an article, there was a story on 60 Minutes just on Sunday, and what they were talking about is the convergence of kind of hacker networks in the US, and the name escapes me. Somebody might want to post it in a question to remind me what the name of this is. Group of 25-year-olds, mostly males, in the United States and Canada, but they've aligned themselves now with Russian state authorities in terms of, creating, really, really challenging strategies. And this is an area which, it's like a lot of records and governance kinds of things, where you try to convince executives of the risk here. And unfortunately, in the past, a lot of people have said, well, I'll just take my chances with the negative lottery, but I'm not going to win this lottery. But the reality is that if you're an exposed business, particularly a regulated business or a governmental business, this ought to be top of your list right now, because the implications are just mind-boggling. And you have to protect those assets that you have, those key information assets, which lots of times are, records assets.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the names of these groups are just nicknames that people give them to identify them. They don't name themselves necessarily, but you're totally right. And so allying yourself with cybersecurity organizations and talking about the value that you can provide in terms of knowledge of where data is, how people use it, can really be an asset to cybersecurity teams. And they're probably not putting those dots together themselves.
Yeah, Colin chimed in on the Q&A and filled in the gaps in my mind, and it's Scattered Spider was the group they talked about. Awesome name, but horrible group.
Great. All right, so now let's move on to the number one scenario. I am not ashamed to admit I knew Copilot was going to be big and generative AI was going to be big, but I was not considering how helpful the executive attention on this would be for compliance. So pretty much all my customer conversations these days are around how data security and data compliance are necessary for Copilot deployment as a prerequisite to prepare. So on the data security side, people are concerned about how do I ensure my sensitive data isn't being leaked through really other Gen AI technologies that I don't want people using. How can I ensure that someone's not using a confidential document and then sharing the results with someone who shouldn't have access? Well, the good news is Microsoft Purview has all these protections in place out of the box. So, it's easy to have those conversations about readiness. And then on the compliance side, oh man, the emphasis on now having lifecycle management around content as a way to increase quality of the information you get back from a generative AI tool like Copilot. If you have, again, our ROT, and really it's the O, the obsolete in the ROT acronym, that's the biggest concern. If the data is obsolete, the Copilot response gives you citations, but it's hard to know when you just open a document, is this still current? Is this the HR time off policy from 5 years ago, or is this the most current one? It's really hard to tell, as it would be from any generative AI technology, or just doing a search, it's hard to tell, right? And so there's now more emphasis on properly managing the life cycle of data to get more out of these investments.
I love your graphic in the middle, and Microsoft probably spent $1 gazillion to develop that, but it's the point that I wanted to make with regards to this, it's very symptomatic of that graphic, which is that there's a story on The Daily yesterday, and the Daily podcast, and what they were talking about is the voracious appetite that AI systems have for information and data and content. And so, the point in the story, which I found stunning, was that, one of the things that happened with ChatGPT was that an inflection point was reached in 2021 in which it had consumed all of the available information on the internet. I mean, think about that for a second. That's just kind of a mind-boggling statement. And the same thing with Google and the same thing with Facebook, that all that information had been consumed. And so then that raises, these systems are voracious in terms of their need for data. And so then that raises two things, I think, which are kind of a push me, pull you kind of thing, hence my fascination with the graphic here, is that, AI systems eventually are already started consuming our internal content to get smarter and smarter and smarter. And at the same time, AI systems are key to making all that stuff available in the first place, because you can't really do that manually anymore. And so that's a weird intersection, but I think it's kind of good news for people in this space, because, it really puts us front and center. I mean, we know something about this intersection, and I think it's a role that we can help play, that is a scenario that I think becomes really important for people positioning themselves long-term.
I think you're exactly right. And, not to tease the upcoming portion of the webinar too much, but I think, the tips that we're going to go over for, actually running a program are essential to follow to take advantage of this opportunity. Yeah. Well, with that, let's dive into the next section, which is on can we meet the requirements of compliance programs out of the box with Microsoft 365? So to answer this, I am going to have a simple slide that kind of explains not just Microsoft compliance philosophy, but Microsoft's philosophy on this question, pretty much since we were formed as a company. So Microsoft's mission is to empower every person on the planet to achieve more. And, not every person on the planet has the same requirements, the same needs, the same things that they need from their technology, right? And compliance programs are, meant to be broad, way beyond Microsoft 365, obviously, and should, again, be mostly focused on the people and processes around compliance, with the technology as an enabler. And so, I'm not going to sit here and say that every requirement everyone could ever think of would be met out of the box. And that's why we think of this as kind of a threefold strategy. So first is what you can do just out of the box in the Microsoft Purview portal, clicking around as a records manager. And we certainly have extremely large organizations that operate in many, many countries in heavily regulated industries that are using out of the box. However, it depends on your needs and your requirements. So then there's what I would consider like admin advanced configuration. So things like PowerShell scripting, where it's not exactly like writing code, but it's like more advanced than what you can do in the user interface. And that's where, a lot of times consulting firms can help, or your talented IT staff or whomever. And then a hugely important part of Microsoft's story is our partners, our excellent partners that build products on top of our platforms like DocPoint, who utilize our APIs, which are ways that the application that the partner company builds can talk to our systems, and they're better together. There's various pros and cons of all of these approaches, but we very much embrace and promote and help provide funding and support to partner companies, because they are a very, very important part of the Microsoft story. I know, John, what are your thoughts on that?
This, I like there's an elegance in the simplicity of this slide that I like. You know, I've been, as everybody knows, I've been around this block a long, long time. And so I can't, if I had a nickel for every conversation I had about whether SharePoint was records capable, I'd have a, you know, I probably wouldn't need to do webinars anymore, but that was always an issue. So the technology, and as a result, people deployed standalone solutions to deal with records management, and they kind of left their collaborative content over here on the side and you know, hope that they would converge someday. And I think the inflection point that's occurred is that the underlying technology in M365 kind of takes care of a huge number of those records management potential scenarios. And that wasn't always the case with SharePoint, but it is now. And so now the question becomes, what are the people and what are the solutions that I need to use to extend and fully leverage that capability? And we'll probably come to this later on during some of the lessons learned and stuff like that. But, you know, one of the lessons learned is that just because something is out of the box doesn't mean you don't necessarily, it doesn't mean you won't need outside help in order to fully leverage the capabilities. And that's kind of where a partner capability comes from. But it is a robust platform that allows you to do all that stuff in one place, which becomes, you know, really, really important. And so my one lesson learned, again, jumping the gun maybe along the way in talking to different user organizations, is that they assume sometimes that out of the box means that they take care of the other two automatically. You have to be just as disciplined about those other two capabilities, your APIs, your extensibility, your configuration. You have to be very disciplined about that, or you won't fully leverage the capabilities.
Exactly. And, you know, I'll just add that, you know, kind of underlying this is a philosophy, which is you person here on the webinar, hey, your organization should be choosing what's best for you. You shouldn't have a technology company like Microsoft dictating to you what your strategy should be. And, you know, it takes a lot of work to make this vision a reality. And it's not something that every technology company does. A lot of them are happy to have closed systems. But I guess we try to compete on having a good enough product that you wouldn't want to leave rather than artificially locking people in.
Yeah, and I think it also, you know, highlights there's always been a bias in the records community, and I understand it because it's just a natural bias towards perfection as opposed to risk mitigation. And, you know, they're not mutually exclusive, but, you know, given the volume of information that people are creating right now, no solution is going to be perfect. And so that means that you have to figure out how you hammer the most nails with the fewest hammers, if that's an appropriate analogy. But anyway.
Yeah, that might be on the list of lessons learned
Okay.
later in this section because it's so important. Yeah. All right. So next, let's dive into licensing. You know, licensing there's this joke that you need to have a PhD in Microsoft licensing to truly understand it. Sadly, I have the PhD in Purview licensing. And so I've tried to simplify this as much as possible and provide additional resources. But I will say, you know, if you are an organization that's large enough to have a Microsoft account team, just let them figure it out for you because they're going to be able to do all sorts of discounts and fancy stuff. If you need to go through a reseller, that's where you sometimes have to tell the reseller what you want to buy. So standard disclaimer slide, the information in this webinar is for informational purposes. It's not meant to be a legally binding communication. If you want the legally binding one, please check out these links here. At one point, I spent over 40 hours rewriting our official service description licensing terms to try to make it very, very clear. So I've really tried, but that's the link there, the DLM/licensing link.
So if people say that Erica promised them a discount on this webinar, that's not the case?
Nope. But there are a lot of great discount programs available that your reseller or account rep can talk to you about. Okay, so there's different types of licenses you can purchase, right? Some of them include like everything that Microsoft makes. Some of them include just the M365 plus records management stuff. So, but as a shorthand, I kind of think of things in two buckets. So you hear people say like E3 or E5. Sometimes they'll say standard for E3 and premium for E5. These all mean the same thing. Now, under that, here's all the fancy jargon for the different licenses that are kind of included in that. I am not going to go into the differences between those in this session, but I do have links that will help you figure it out if you really want to. Just really standard. We do have like our kind of standard commercial one, which is the one probably 90% of you have. We do have special ones for education, US federal government, and then frontline workers, people who don't sit in front of a computer all day for their job, and maybe they just need to use email and Teams on their phone or a shared kiosk sometimes. So what does this all mean? Well, there is a wonderful Microsoft employee based in Australia who has made the licensing resource that everyone uses, even internally, to understand this stuff. And you can access it at M365maps.com. It breaks down what's included in all these different types. It's very graphic. You can click around. So highly recommend checking that out if you really want to torture yourself and learn this stuff. As it applies to records, though, just a couple examples. This isn't the exhaustive list. In E3, you're going to have our retention policies, which you would apply to, an entire mailbox, an entire SharePoint site as an example. You have retention labels that are manually applied by an end user. Those are in the standard or E3 section. And then in E5, this is where you have maybe the more robust records management features that I think your average records manager would say that they want. So things like automatically applying the labels based on certain criteria, targeting policies based on someone's role or the geography they work in, doing the disposition review and approval before the content's deleted, making a file immutable from a records management perspective, and then event-based retention. Those are just the top kind of features. Of course, there is more. I will say that, I think we are very, very competitively priced if you think of us as a records management solution. I have done the research on what our competitors charge, and every product costs a licensing fee on top of Microsoft 365. And so if you think of us like a product in that way, it makes sense. So I hate to ask, John, any thoughts on the licensing?
No, you're right about the PhD thing. I get a lot of confusion about that, and the other thing I try to tell people is that this is a progression, and so even if maybe you can't convince people to go in the direction of E5, which is where a lot of the really robust records capabilities are, there's an awful lot of work to be done with the E3 capabilities to get your information ready for E5. I think Microsoft as a company probably smartly has put a lot of the automated capabilities under the E5 umbrella, because that's where they want you to land ultimately. But I think it ultimately, it ultimately, I think, rests on a business decision, which, different companies and organizations are going to have different approaches to this business decision, which is, do we want to make this our de facto, information management platform, and then do what we need to do to maximize those capabilities? Or do we not want to do that? And, so much occurs in a Microsoft universe that I think for a lot of organizations, they come to the conclusion that, we're going to drive ourselves crazy if we don't figure out how if we don't standardize on this platform and figure out how we optimize it and go along for the ride. Because the other thing, which is, oh man, this might be also in your lessons learned, is that Microsoft's going at breakneck speed here. And I hear too from a lot of end user organizations, just a really hard time keeping up, because they're operating big, gigantic organizations at scale. And, the technology and practice kind of always move at different rates. And there's always a gap between technology capabilities and the actual practical implementation of those capabilities at scale. But it's kind of like the thing is like expanding more right now. It's really hard to keep up for organizations because we're at a really key inflection point, I think, technology wise, that for me is somewhat similar to the one that we had when we first introduced the internet. Things are going at breakneck speed right now.
Oh man, I think it all depends on your perspective, because like feel like we're having a hard time keeping up with like the pace of the world, even, so maybe it's just how things are these days.
Now, I remember it used to be back in the SharePoint days, Erica. We did these SharePoint seminars across the country when I was at AIM in different parts of the country. And so I'd always started off, I'd ask a question, whether it was at 2007 or MOS or 2013 or whatever the iteration was current of Microsoft, I'd say, where are you guys right now? And usually those seminars kind of coincided with launch of the product in those big bunches that occurred. And inevitably, a year after the introduction of the newest platform, there'd be like 10 or 15% that were on the newest platform. There were, 40 or 50% that were still struggling to get to that platform. And there would always be a couple of, rogue 2002 implemented Windows SharePoint services out there way on the tail end of the deployment curve. And so there's always a lag there. But I think now in cloud time, it just, there aren't those big jumps anymore. It's just a continuous cycle of enhancement and improvement and technology development, which is hard to keep up with. The good thing is that it's all being done internal to the system rather than having to deploy an entirely new version of the product. But it's still a challenge to keep up.
Yeah, and so maybe that's a good transition to our lessons learned, because honestly, they're about dealing with this reality of keeping up in the world we're living in now. So what are the 5 kind of things I see over and over again? And I think, John, these might resonate with you a bit as well.
And post any on the questions that you guys come up with that you want us to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'm going to count down again from 5 to 1. This might be lesson number 1, but you got to focus on the end user experience. If you make something that's too hard for them to use, then it's failed. I've seen this not only at, less regulated organizations, but highly regulated organizations, governments that do have a heavy emphasis on a compliance culture. If they do make it too cumbersome for the end user or too disruptive, then it fails. John, what have you seen around this?
It all goes back to that triad of people, process, and technology, and it's ultimately people is the big part of that pyramid. And if it's not a system that is invisible to people, odds are it's going to fail. And I've been around long enough You know, the idea, we always had these ideas that we would develop these like really complicated retention systems, and you know, we would try to educate people on it, we try to threaten them on, we would try to do all sorts of things and try to convince them to drag and drop content and documents, you know, into the appropriate buckets and all that stuff. It's got to be behind the scenes and it's got to be invisible, or it's not going to occur. People are too busy right now.
Yeah. Oh, I see that we have a question. Can you please elaborate on the number of licenses included in the disposition functionality? I heard it's only 200 in a tenant, and I'm not sure that would be enough for our organization. I'm not sure where that rumor came from. You license every Microsoft 365 user if you're going to be using the E5 functionality. There's not a limit of 200 anything. I mean, if you really want to make every user a disposition reviewer, you can absolutely do that. And, you know, at that scale, there might be some nuances to how you might want to configure it to make it maintainable and have a good end user experience. But yeah, if you want to have 100,000 reviewers, you can do that.
Oh, yeah. I don't know about that.
All right. So then lesson 4 is a little bit related to 5, but because this is so important, I really wanted to emphasize it, which is think about the impact of productivity is really the litmus test. If security makes something too difficult, people are just going to spin up their own cloud subscription and pay for it to get around it. If what we're trying to do with compliance is causing them to not be able to do their job as quickly and efficiently, they're going to do what they can to get around it, right? Because they have their boss looking over their shoulder too. Yeah. Any thoughts on that one, John?
And I think for me, it's again, not to be a repetitive, but that people, process, technology, there is the people aspect of productivity, which is individual productivity, and goes back to your previous point on lesson 5 about not impinging on people's desire to get their work done. And then the other aspect of productivity, I think, is organizational productivity. And then, you know, ultimately, I think the effectiveness of these systems, and this is one of the things that DocPoint spends some time thinking about, is how does all this tie to the process in which people operate on a day-to-day basis? So I think too often we've tended to view content and process as kind of separate buckets, when really they are just overlapping manifestations of the same thing. You know, processes operate based on documents and content, and vice versa. And so I think that, you know, you got to make sure that what you're doing ultimately contributes to the efficiency and effectiveness of the organization as a whole moving forward, and your department moving forward, as well as your individual productivity.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so this is the one I alluded to earlier around analysis paralysis, or, you know, trying to maybe build the perfect system. No system's ever going to be perfect. Even if you had all the time and money in the world and resources and coded your perfect records management system, it still would not be perfect, trust me. The other thing is as we start putting things out in the real world, we're going to learn things that we did not know when we were doing our planning. And so taking an iterative approach and just starting with something, learning from it, then continuing to build in complexity where it's really beneficial is ultimately going to result in a better project and a better compliance system with probably a higher level of % compliance than trying to design the most perfect system at the beginning and then hope it works out. I know, John, what do you think?
Yeah, and I think when I think about this one, it's, you know, the strategy is a long-term thing. And so I think organizations need to think about the role that M365 is going to play in their organization and be very crisp about understanding that moving forward. but the tactics to implement along the way of implementing that strategy, you can't allow those to be handicapped by a fear of the future and by, you know, the desire for a perfect system, because nothing's going to be perfect. And so I realize that's a dynamic tension. That's a hard thing to do in organizations, particularly a hard thing in organizations when one is looking over one shoulder all the time. But sitting still at a time when things are moving so quickly is just a recipe for disaster, because the problem is not going to get better. It's going to get worse and worse and worse unless you do something.
Exactly. We have a couple questions coming up in the chat. So the first one is, could you give some examples on how to automate the retention functionality where we want to use that? It would take some user involvement if we use the location-based approach, like, you know, put this file in this SharePoint site, etc. Is this what you had in mind, or is there some other method? So we have 6 different methods that you can use to automatically apply policies to content. One is definitely based on location. Maybe alluding to lesson number 2, some of them are more security based, like the presence of sensitive information in a file or an email, then apply a certain retention policy. Others are, you know, based on metadata, right, which has been around forever. And there's other ones as well. So we provide these multiple options because what we found is that even within an organization, one method is not going to work for every single situation in your organization. Usually, you know, maybe using the location base might work for 80%. And then once you have that going, using that iterative approach, maybe you're like, okay, now it's time to start tackling the 20%. And it might use some of these other methods to now automatically label that. So that's kind of how I think about it. I don't know, John, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that's definite. I can't really add anything to that. I think you've got that spot on.
The next question is around policy limits. Any given SharePoint site could have one of 1,000 GRS and RCS categories. So my question, I guess, for that would be more, again, let's take that end user focus. How would an end user choose between 1,000 GRS categories? And that's one of the reasons why we've not decided to put our, you know, resources. We have limited resources, right, for our product too. We don't have unlimited money. So we've said, okay, we actually don't want to like have the ability to have 5,000 SharePoint or retention labels in a SharePoint site, because the end user experience would be so poor that it wouldn't work anyway. So why would we prioritize that? I mean, always happy to hear feedback about that being wrong. But what's a better approach might be to, for example, identify like this SharePoint site is related to this government program or this service we're providing. And these are the I don't even want to say 100, you know, these are the retention schedules that apply to that program. And then you can say, only show these categories on that site and narrow down the list for them. Just as an example. Any thoughts, John?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I was thinking about our people, process, and technology triad. There probably is a people, process, technology, and policy. Maybe it's a cube rather than a pyramid. I don't know, but I don't know what the right metaphor is. But so often I see that organizations don't look at their policies at the time they are trying to drive automation. And that's just such a huge mistake, because lots of times those policies were driven by a much simpler world. And so, you know, you wind up with people with, you know, a gazillion items in a gazillion retention labels in a record system that maybe was appropriate when the volume of information was relatively modest and the number of records was relatively modest. But if you're trying to apply that not only to records, but also to information, broadly defined, you need much larger buckets. And if you don't take a look at the policies, you're going to wind up trying to automate something that's impossible to automate.
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel for especially the records managers in government, because you're given legislation you need to follow. Essentially, there's not a lot of flexibility. But I've been having a lot of success with working with a lot of the regulatory bodies to adopt a machine implementable and bigger bucket approach. Like, I don't think Nara would mind me telling this story, but like when we first started working together, I looked at the GRS and I said, can a computer like make the decisions needed to make this work, or does a human have to touch every single document for this schedule to work? And it turned out there are quite a few categories that require a human to touch it, every single one. And they're actually now going back and rethinking how to make those, they're calling it machine implementable.
Yeah.
And so I the struggle is real. I want to validate that, but I hope that we're all kind of starting to move in the right, in a direction that's more aligned to the reality of the world.
And there's a cultural change within organizations that's going to be this can be difficult to bring about. And it's kind of similar to the one where we have thousands and thousands of people that are in accidents on highways every day, and yet if an autonomous car is in a vehicle, it makes all the headline news, and so that comfort of trying to figure out where that line is between human intervention and a machine dealing with it, that's a hard one to deal with, and one that I think organizations will struggle with.
Yeah, actually, if everyone on this call could think about that a bit, I would appreciate, because that's honestly where right now what I'm thinking about a lot when it comes to how could technologies like generative AI and Copilot assist us with some of these high volume tasks. That's the $1 million question, is where's the line between trusting a machine to make the decision and where's the line, like where a human really does need to be doing stuff. Like, that might be the question of the next 10 years. So
I was going to say, we're going to have a lot of instances of trying to think through that question, because it's not a simple one, but yeah.
Is there anything to consider to ensure that any mistakes or changes are easier to do rather than having to start over from scratch? So my first tip is do not test in production. So that means don't be trying stuff out for the first time in your real live environment. You can get free test tenants from your Microsoft account team. If you purchase from a reseller, it's frankly worth it to spend the monthly fee to have a test environment so you can go in and click around and try stuff out for yourself, make mistakes and learn from them before going it in production. Now, once you're pretty sure and how things work, or you're ready to go, most stuff is you can undo it. The only thing is if you use regulatory retention labels, those are for FINRA compliance and some of the US financial services stuff. Write once, read many. We legally cannot undo it. That is literally the point. So don't use that unless you really need to.
Yep.
Can you apply labels to certain folders versus the whole SharePoint site? Yes, you can. So you would just set the label on the folder and it would then apply to all the content in that folder. All right, so I think we're getting near the end of time. So I'll keep lesson 2 short because I think we've already driven home this point. Our compliance and records world is no longer an isolated activity. We're all blending together. The vast majority of the time, when I've observed that these teams have not worked together in the past. And so, bake in some time and grace for learning how to collaborate with these different teams, learn about what their top priorities are, and be willing, to compromise, and also fight for what you think are your top priorities. But if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So pick, I guess this is just general like life advice that we all follow, but pick your battles, and all that.
Yeah, all the records management models have these different functions kind of around that circle, and it reminds me of that old cartoon where the scientist is up there and he's got all these equations on the board, and then he's got this blank spot in the middle, and somebody says, what happens here? And his answer is, well, that's where the miracle occurs. And so how you figure out as an organization how these different functions communicate with each other and how each of them understand each other. Again, non-technical set of issues, but a really important set of issues.
Exactly. All right. So now the number one lesson. Let's see if it'll go. You're never going to be finished. And this isn't just specific to Microsoft 365, right? Just broadly. So I think there's two types of never finished. So one is as you go through this and you're working on your program, what is the operational state going to look like? So what tasks are going to need to be performed on a regular basis, and what job role is going to do them? Because it might be that maybe you're the one who kind of invents the new things and like makes the compliance program improvements, but that means that someone has to kind of take over after you to then operate it on an ongoing basis, which means negotiating with their boss, with HR, to make sure it's an actual objective of their job and not just a favor. And then there's let's start our M365 implementation. This is the flavor of the month that we're doing, or probably 6 months. Let's get it to 80%. And then we need to go and worry about, making sure we're recording consent on our website. And that's the next biggest risk. Again, that risk register and risk management, and kind of working through like, what are the highest risks that could be the worst impact, and going down your punch list and prioritizing, because that list never is done. But that's job security also.
Again, it's a journey, I think, and a journey is going to be completed in short spurts and short leaps, and so you need to have, I think, really crisp objectives for each of those iterations along the way, so that the business has confidence that things are moving forward. But it's also frustrating in that it is a journey that doesn't eventually end. It just continues.
I love what you just said there about having clear objectives. I've found just from my background in consulting that at least once a month saying like, these are the results I'm going to drive, doing them and reporting back. And then even better, if you can back it up with some kind of measurement or data showing the impact. That's how, as a consultant, I got my contracts renewed over and over, but same thing for getting funding and building trust in what you're doing. Less than a month, unless, we have a micromanager for a boss, it seemed to be too often for people to care, but about once a month kept it fresh in their mind that this was going according to plan and doing good things.
So we're getting near the end of the time. Erica, maybe you could, before we wrap up, just address Carolyn's question about legal role in M365. And again, kind of that, I think that ties to the whole question of how do you leverage across departments?
Yeah. So a couple things. So specifically to IM, if you're going to be doing things like making risk trade-offs, or maybe simplifying like your retention schedule, or kind of making other decisions that are, just making changes, it's a good idea just to have somebody in legal say, yes, I agree. to kind of cover your back, frankly. Also, like they can bring a good perspective in a lot of times on what really is the priority in terms of risk. Because it's really legal reasons that are going to create fines, create news. It's because like an actual legal event occurred. And so having them kind of weigh in on that stuff can be very valuable. I don't know, John, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think the legal question is interesting because on the one hand, sometimes they can be an obstacle, because they have their own way of dealing with things. On the other hand, lots of times that's where money is. And so building those alliances and helping them understand not why records management is important, because they probably won't ever care, but how records management and governance and data governance can help them get their jobs done more effectively and more cost effectively and with less risk. That's a really key intersection, I think.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll add is that depending on the type of organization you're in, if it's a private company, non-government, especially based in the US, your legal department is very concerned about litigation and what is discoverable. And guess what? If it exists, it is legal. They're legally required to turn it over to the other side if it meets certain criteria. If it doesn't exist, then they don't have to. And guess what? That's records management.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Should I go to the last slide?
Yeah, I think so. So first of all, just Erica, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'll give you a warning before we close. I want you to, while I'm talking on the next series, think about one key takeaway you want to leave with people, and I'll come back to you with that to close. And our next session will be on May 8th, which is this question again of thinking about M365, not just as a way to manage content and documents, but as a driver to automation within your organization. And Scott and Janice will talk through some of the issues associated with that. So I hope you'll join us. I guess secondly, I hope that as you think about this whole area of the intersection between M365 and automation, and between M365 and governance, that you'll let me know topics that you want to have addressed during this series, and that you'll help spread the word about the series. And so I hope you'll join us for that. And then if you just hit the next slide, Erica. Lastly, if you have any questions that you want to explore, these are the guys that you should talk to. Jot down the emails. Again, we'll send around the copy of the presentation so that you have the contact information. But if you have problems, you have issues, you have things you want to explore, these guys are very well versed in some of the issues that you guys are dealing with along the way. So thank you all so much for being here. And Erica, one final takeaway, and then we'll close it out.
Yeah, I guess what I'm going to leave with is, you know what? There's just a lot going on in the world today, and your best is good enough. And that's all that the world needs, is for us to just try our hardest. Maybe some days that's 20%, maybe it's 100 other days. And you're not alone. We're all in this together. We're all figuring it out together. And if you need help, sometimes you have to ask, and which can be hard, but we're all in it together.
Great. Thank you so much, Erica. We'll see you again sometime.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.